The panel we next have is a group of national lab leaders. The national labs, of course, are a critical piece of the intellectual infrastructure of New Mexico, as well as a critical piece of the just the employment and really high-tech job work of New Mexico, which I think the New Mexico Community College or New Mexico Chamber of Commerce report really highlighted as important. So on our panel today, we have Colonel Eric Felt, who is Commander and Phillips Research Site Director and Space Vehicles Directorate at the Air Force Research Laboratory. Welcome, Colonel Felt. We have Dr. Kelly Hammett from the Directed Energy Directorate, also at the Air Force Research Laboratory. Hi, Kelly. We have Dr. Tom Mason, CEO of Triad National Security and Director of Los Alamos National Lab. Good to have you here. And Mr. Scott Isles, the Associate Lab Director and CFO for Sandia National Labs. Good to have you here as well. So I'd like to start with Colonel Felt, and really a question kind of paralleling one of Dean Montoya's questions around talent and the talent and the impact of that talent in New Mexico. As I've noted, the national labs are a critical piece of the New Mexico economy. I'm curious, what would you characterize as your most critical infrastructure and human talent needs to support your ongoing success?
Thank you for the question, and it is a great question. What we're seeing now is that our nation and our world are in the middle of a space renaissance. It's extremely exciting, most exciting time to be working in the space business since the 1960s. We're really at the cusp of growing a $1 trillion space economy. The experts are just arguing about whether that $1 trillion space economy is going to arrive in 2025 or 2030 or 2035, but it's definitely coming. And so it's an exciting time to be part of the lab at Kirtland and part of that business. The reason I mention that is that I think that, the 4,000 New Mexico jobs and the $600 million of New Mexico economic impact that come from the Air Force Research Lab, I really think are just the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more potential that's there. And I was thrilled to see in the report the emphasis on the technology and the professional technology workforce and things that we can do to make New Mexico a friendly place for those employees and those businesses to locate. Because the answer to your question is really the number one barrier that I see that's limiting our growth is the quality and quantity of STEM talent in New Mexico. And that right now I have 50 vacancies that I cannot find the right people to fill. I think that is just, again, the tip of the iceberg of what we could do here. The recent report on the state of the space industrial base that I was a part of that came out in the spring talked about how we're going to have 10,000 new jobs in the space business in this country over the next 5 years. That, again, that was just based on NASA demand signal, not even on the stand-up of the Space Force, possible location of Space Command. I think this is an area of high growth and high opportunity for New Mexico. There are tons of great things about New Mexico. I love being here. This is my third assignment here, but I wanted to be sure I brought to your attention a couple of data points that have not been talked about yet that I think we should address. The first is that in terms of our active duty assignments for our officers, and I have about 100 technical officers here within the Air Force Research Lab. We moved to a talent marketplace this year where officers can go in and bid on the assignments that they want. And of course, they're located all around the world and around the nation. And the data from that then shows you where the highest disconnect between available jobs and people who want to fill those jobs are. And New Mexico, according to that metric, is the second least desirable place to go. So I was like, wow, that's pretty eye-opening. Let's dig into why that is. And that really kind of brings me to my second point, where I went and did a survey of our 100 officers here, informal survey. But I was like, why don't more people want to move to Kirtland in New Mexico? This is a great place to live. We have a lot of things going for us. And it just the number one theme: quality of K through 12 education. They don't want to bring their families here. They want to make sure they have good education for their children. That is the number one thing that they bring up. Number two, crime. Number three, availability of healthcare. But those are distant seconds behind this K through 12 thing. So I think I really liked the discussion in the chat. I think I would recommend coming out of this that we set up some kind of K through 12 task force to get after how to provide a better education for the workforce that has working age children. that they are the ones that most concerned about moving here. And with all those new jobs, we do need new people to move here. We need to focus on getting STEM workers to immigrate here from out of state. The third data point I wanted to bring up is that Secretary of the Air Force put out 2 new criteria on how she's going to decide where new missions are going to be located. And this criteria was applied and is being applied to whether Space Command is going to be located here. And the 2 new criteria she put out there are quality of K through 12 education and license reciprocity. We already talked a little bit about license reciprocity. To me, it seems like some low-hanging fruit, but New Mexico was yellow on that and red on K through 12. So we have those 3 data points. I think that highlights some of the barriers to growth that we see here. So I see a lot of opportunity, but I like this forum and the opportunity to get after some of those challenges in a head-on kind of way. 3 specific recommendations I just wanted to be sure to throw out there that are not already in the report there is number 1, again, this focus on we don't have enough STEM workers in the state. We need to make New Mexico a more attractive place for out-of-state STEM employees to relocate. Consider a New Mexico income tax credit for STEM tuition paid during the past 10 years. This would have a lot of benefits in a couple of different pools. First, it would be an incentive for college students who graduate from other states to move here and then stay and work. Secondly, it would be an incentive for those who left New Mexico to go to school, and many do, to then return to the state, the STEM boomerang idea. And thirdly, an incentive then for college students to move here before college, go to a New Mexico college, and then stay here. So that's a specific idea I hadn't heard talked about, but it's something we've been discussing as a good way to recruit some new college graduates to the state, and we do need more of them. The second new idea I haven't heard talked about is really in the K through 12 education area. Again, I think we need a task force to look at that, but how about creating a flagship STEM high school? Many other states have this. The one that I went to college in North Carolina, we had the North Carolina School of Science and Math. It was established about a century ago. It is a residential high school focused on STEM education, selective admissions. The residential part's important because then that helps the rural parts of the states because they can send their best and brightest to this school. There's a lot of spillover effects from that because then that high school can determine curriculum that can flow down to all of the rest of the schools in the state. I think that's an idea that's worthy of further consideration. And honestly, it's the highest ROI idea in K through 12 education that I have heard of. And I really liked it in the states where I've lived that had something like that. People liked having it in the state, even if their kids didn't end up going there. And then the third thing is just, I do think the license reciprocity thing is some low hanging fruit. I saw it in the report. I don't know why we haven't passed that yet, but it seems to me like that would be one easy way to make this state more attractive for STEM workers from other states to come in. So I just wanted to open with that I think we have great potential. Space is a booming business. I'm here to help and to make that happen. And those are some 3 specific data points and 3 specific suggestions that have come out of my discussions on this topic. And I look forward to further engagement to help tackle these challenges together. Thanks.
Thank you, Colonel Faust. Appreciate that. Turning to Dr. Tom Mason from Los Alamos, partnerships has been mentioned in many contexts. It's described in the report. It was in the part of the conversation with the university presidents. And there's, I think really identified in the report is the need for alignment among New Mexico's assets. And those assets, of course, include the facilities, the centers, the intellectual talent at the labs. I'm curious what you think are the kinds of partnerships that could better leverage the lab's assets jointly to advance the New Mexico economy and also enable the lab to better achieve its mission.
So maybe starting with the second bit first in terms of the partnerships to help us achieve our mission. We are in a growth mode. We've been hiring new staff at a fair clip, about 1,000 new staff a year for the last 4 or 5 years. The year that just completed at the end of September, we brought on 1,150 new staff. So, despite the pandemic, that continues, and in fact is likely to continue for some number of years, given the fact that we had a pretty favorable budget outcome with the resolution of the FY21 budget that has about $1 billion increase in funding for Los Alamos. So that money turns into either people that we hire at the lab or people that are hired by contractors to the laboratory. We kind of execute work by both mechanisms. And it's a wide spectrum of skills that we're looking for. I mean, often I think people might think that, you know, being Los Alamos, it's PhD physicists, and I happen to be one of those, but in fact, only 20% of our employees are PhD scientists and engineers. The other 80% are all across the spectrum of skills, whether it's you know, human resources professionals, creative communications types, financial skills, or hands-on work with the skilled crafts and technicians. So, and in order to meet those workforce needs, we're working to create partnerships with educational institutions across that spectrum. So ranging from working with high schools in our area and the New Mexico building trades for apprenticeship programs for the skilled craft, to things like the joint appointments that were mentioned by Van Ramiro with New Mexico Tech that are executed under the framework of new master agreements that we've set up, not only with New Mexico Tech, but UNM and New Mexico State. You know, that's obviously more focused on the graduate education and those masters and PhD scientists and engineers. And of course, in between, there's a lot of stuff at the bachelor's level and associate's degrees working with community colleges. And so we're trying to structure programs, particularly at the community college level, that are tailored to specific workforce needs that we have. And we're starting to see some success with that in terms of actually being able to hire more staff from New Mexico. If you look right now, about 40% of the current laboratory staff were recruited from the state of New Mexico. If you look at that hiring we did last year, the 1,150 new employees, 75% were recruited from the state of New Mexico. And part of the reason for that is because we've been able to work with the educational institutions to kind of set up pipelines that meet those needs. And we're going to need to do more of it as we look at the growth associated with the funding increases that we've seen. We're not done with that, and there are more areas that we need to target. But I have been very gratified by the willingness of the higher ed institutions in our region to work with us to help us build those pipelines and you know, begin the process of bringing people into the lab early in the education. It was already mentioned, I think, that involvement of students in research is a great way to motivate them. We pay them, so it helps financially. And in many cases, they wind up being our employees. If I go into a room at the lab and say, how many people here began as a student, as an intern, or as a graduate student, majority hands will go up. Doesn't matter what room it is, what group I'm talking to, that's true. So that's good. In terms of the economic development side of things and partnerships for that, I think the first thing to recognize is that as a taxpayer-funded institution, we have a responsibility to ensure that those investments that are made by the US government have a payback for the taxpayers. And that tends to happen through deployment of the science and technology. Now, in some cases, being a national security lab, deployment really means deployment in the sense of systems that the military, the Navy, the Air Force deploy in support of our nuclear deterrent. And so we do a lot of that. But a lot of our science, technology, and engineering has potential for deployment in a different sense, in the sense of innovations that can inform business opportunities and lead to economic growth. And I think we have an equal responsibility to facilitate that type of deployment, just as we facilitate the deployment in the national defense sense. And as Dan Arvizu mentioned in the last session, it does look like the new administration that's going to come in is going to have a particular focus, particularly around areas like energy and climate, and also at bringing more of the technology-based prosperity to regions of the country that, that haven't participated a couple of years ago, Brookings did a study that I think showed that I think it's 20 counties in the US that have experienced the disproportionate economic growth associated with technology development. They're all on the coasts. And there's going to be a focus on that as well. It's almost like Dan knew what the transition team was thinking. I think that's an opportunity for us. Obviously, we have some opportunities, for example, associated with the Four Corners area, where there's an energy transition going on as the coal plant there is decommissioned. There's opportunities around clean energy. It speaks to the environmental justice agenda that Chancellor Arvizu mentioned. And there may be something that we can do pulling together institutions of higher education and the research labs that would help support that would line up very well with that kind of agenda. Still a little bit early yet, transition hasn't happened, so to some extent we're reading the tea leaves, but based on the initial conversations with the transitions teams and what we've seen of the agenda coming, I think we ought to be thinking about how to quickly move out on those sorts of opportunities as they emerge, because we have the assets, and I think others have made that point. The final thing that I'd like to kind of highlight actually is that oftentimes it was pointed out in the initial presentation that, you know, there's a lot in that analysis that the chamber facilitated that sounds familiar. And it was the same sort of things that one heard thinking about economic development, you know, in the 90s or in the 80s or in the 70s in terms of what the needs are. And that's certainly true. One thing that reminded me of is several years ago now, I was reading a study done by the Regional Economic Development Entity in the Cambridge area in the UK. And of course, Cambridge within Europe is kind of a technology hotspot. There's a lot of startups, a lot of biotech and so forth. And this study, you know, started out in the usual way by lamenting the lack of venture capital. You know, just about everyone's down at the knee level compared to Silicon Valley, and Cambridge is no different. So they were lamenting that, lamenting the fact that there wasn't a culture of risk-taking and so forth. And these are themes that you see in all of these reports. One of the interesting things in this Cambridge report is they started with the thesis that the reason that the Cambridge region in the UK had a pretty healthy amount of startup and innovative industry was because of intellectual property from Cambridge University. Turns out that's not the case. Almost none of that activity was associated with tech transfer and licensing in the traditional sense. It was associated with people who had been associated with Cambridge University. It was graduates of the university, people who'd been postdocs there. They liked the area. They were just looking to start companies. That was where they started companies because they knew they could get a workforce. So while licensing and tech transfer is important, you need that legal framework around intellectual property for people to put capital at risk. I think more important is creating the environment where people with those skills want to settle. All of the institutions on this call will benefit from that because we're hiring those people. We're developing them. In some cases, you know, I hate to say this, but if you're really an entrepreneur, you're going to get frustrated working at a national lab at some point in time. You're going to be fed up with bureaucracy and you're going to want to go start a company. We ought to have an environment here that is fertile for those kind of things, and it will actually benefit us in the execution of our missions. And if you think about that kind of triangle between Albuquerque, Santa Fe, and Los Alamos, it's a little bit more extended than the research triangle where Ted comes from. But if you look at the assets there with AFRL and Sandia and UNM and Los Alamos and what Santa Fe is pursuing in terms of their aspirations for technology-based economic development, I think there's a lot we can do. One thing that I'm kind of excited about is that at the moment, we are going through a procurement process to secure some additional space for the lab because we've been growing. We've expanded the aperture on that to a 50-mile radius because we're kind of tapped out up on the mesa. And so that would include, for example, Santa Fe or Espanola. We haven't finished the procurement process. We don't have signed leases yet, but I think it's a pretty likely outcome that we're going to have a beachhead of the lab that's potentially in Santa Fe, closer to Albuquerque, closer to some of those opportunities for interaction. And I think if that happens, that might be something that we can bootstrap on, and maybe some of those clean energy climate opportunities that will be emerging will be the catalyst for doing more. So I think with that, I'll shut up and let some others speak.
Well, thanks, Tom. I appreciate those comments. Mr. Isles, I'm curious just to kind of follow on this from the Sandia perspective. What you see as the partnerships that could help you better realize your economic development goals and mission, again, in alignment with your national security mission.
Yeah, thanks, James. And I won't, a lot of what I'll say probably will mimic what Tom had mentioned relative to Los Alamos. But I think it is important to reflect on what the labs have done over the past few years. And if you think about Sandia, much similar to Los Alamos, we have grown our employee base, to roughly 14,000. And that was primarily done in what we call FY19, calendar September 30th, year ended 2019, where we added 1,900 employees, of which, there was a whole plethora of interns, 849 interns. Most of them come through the New Mexico systems, and the business side, as Tom had mentioned, we hire primarily through UNM and work with the Anderson School to ensure the curriculum is set to meet the needs that we have at the laboratory. We sign an MOU in the project management area to truly try to get these students more prepared to come into the labs and hit the ground running. So relative to where we've been and the economic impact on the employee aspect, very strong in New Mexico. And the numbers very closely mimic what Tom had mentioned relative to the number of New Mexicans. Roughly 60% of those hires came from the state of New Mexico. So that's a good thing. Relative to how we look at the future at Sandia, quite frankly, we have constraints right now, limited in space on the base relative to people in desks. As a result of COVID, we are going to explore a more aggressive remote working situation to hopefully ease up some of those constraints we do have. Within the last 2 years, we did sign 3 new leases in the Albuquerque area that ultimately house greater than 500 employees, of which right now they're vacant because of COVID, and we're really taking an aggressive stance towards social distancing. So we continue to be strong. We'll always have a need in New Mexico for the employees. The areas we look to, which probably no surprise, but the critical skills that we look at today are computer science, cybersecurity, electrical and mechanical engineering. Those are areas, in project management I would also throw into that mix. Those are areas that we find really hard to staff. And so, anything we can do with the universities to look into those areas to maximize the supply of those candidates is the better. And I think there's an opportunity for us to collectively come together to see what we could do. We have to obviously fill the needs of our business, and so we do find ourselves looking outside the state of New Mexico to fill those. And that, I think, is an area that we could probably partner together. Relative to procurements and reflecting a little bit back, in the past few years, we have increased our small business participation in dollar value by greater than 300% in the last 4 years in the state of New Mexico. And a lot of that's driven by we've grown the funding that has come into the labs, and we've made a very concerted effort to reach out to the various chambers. We conduct small business forums every year, and I think with the theme of leveraging some of the things that we have in existence today, I think we should look to the business leaders within the state and the community of Albuquerque in particular to look at those outreach events that we do have. Try to gain those connections and those collaborations. It's hard to do business with the labs, right? So you got to go through this very bureaucratic system, and quite frankly, that's our intent with those connecting points of those outsourcing small business forums, is to truly create those connections by which that small business can understand the requirements that are coming forth within the labs, and ultimately put a name to the face. So who is that person that I talked to on that portal? Who is the person, and now I got a direct contact. So I think those are the basic blocking and tackling things that we have been focusing on here. And then I think we turn the page to the strategic agreements that we have, again, with the theme of leveraging what's in place. Innovate New Mexico. That's a network among the leading research institutions in the state of New Mexico, AFRL, New Mexico State Land, all, you name it, Sandia, UNM, that ultimately allows us to highlight the research and technology opportunities for startup companies, all the economic development resources we do have. There is an event that's hosted annually to showcase the IP that's developed in the state for an audience of investors, inventors, and entrepreneurs. So I think continuing to leverage avenues, venues like that, there's a lot of connections that are already in place. I don't think we maximize them to the extent we can. And so I think it's really either we're going to have to modify those structures, or we're going to have to leverage them more to gain the value. The other one that I'd like to highlight is the strategic alliance with UNM. And in the past summer, Sandia, we did sign a 10-year MOU that focuses on how UNM and Sandia can collaborate to solve the challenges relating to national security. And the MOU focuses in 3 areas: solving big problems, sustaining and engaging human capital, and accelerating technology adaptation by introducing new ideas, science, and technology into the industrial and federal marketplace. Bottom line is, again, it creates this connectivity that I think we're onto something here. And for whatever reason, in the past, we haven't kind of knocked those out of the park. We've got the Sandia Industrial Park that I think has had some great success, but that's taken many years, right? I mean, after 20 years, it's grown over time. I think if we can continue to leverage these forums that we have and find offshoots of those by which we could, you have a willing partner here at Sandia. Sometimes we get a little bit paralyzed in the national security element of what we do and the IP that we could transfer. But what I've seen over my 4 years here is when we do put smart people together and we create a focus and a lot of energy in these things that are already there, we can prevail and come up with some great things for the state of New Mexico. The last thing I'd like to highlight is, again, in the economic development, there are incentives that we do have today in place. And the 5% pricing preference to New Mexico business, again, we're getting to the blocking and tackling things. We put that in place 4 years ago, and we've only had 2 suppliers take advantage of that. So it's telling me one of 2 things. Either New Mexico companies are really competitive with those outside the state of New Mexico and don't need that pricing preference, or we're just there's not enough businesses in the state that understand what that preference really entails. We've tried our best to have a communication plan around that, but ultimately, I don't think we haven't leveraged that to the extent I think it is out there. So the theme I would just continue to convey for this forum and the economics of New Mexico is just, let's continue to leverage what we have. If they're not working, let's not throw them away and ignore them. Let's look to tweak them and update them to make it work for all of us collectively, to leverage the labs, the IP that's out there, and break through some of the barriers that we do have on our side that we may not be seeing. So that's all I had today, James. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. I appreciate it. Dr. Hammond, I'm curious to take up from Scott this question about incentives. Do you see opportunities to better align incentives between the research universities, the labs, and the state of New Mexico?
Thanks, James. I don't have a really deep bench on this. I guess I will just say, to start with, I agree with all the great comments of the rest of my panelist members. I've got a whole list of things I was ready to talk about, and they covered almost all of those. Incentives is certainly one that we care about, because what we really care about here in the national security enterprise is our industrial base. You mentioned several times, we have a mission. We're funded out of public taxpayer dollars. It's important for us to accomplish those mission objectives. And the heart of that is the STEM workforce and also the professional workforce, as was mentioned earlier, that allows us to do that. So we got to have that STEM pipeline. But we've got to get people to move here. So that's all been covered. How do we incentivize people to move here? And there's a whole bunch of things, from addressing the crime and the educational stuff to having a branding and marketing campaign that makes New Mexico an attractive place to be. On the business side of things, one of the things that's worked very effectively for us is New Mexico gross receipts tax exemption. For certain technology areas. So in AFRL here, we are the centers of gravity in the nation for space and directed energy research and technologies. And so there was some comment earlier about legislative relief on some of these onerous tax provisions. And that's one that has worked for us. We do not have a majorly growing budget like Sandia Laboratory does, although space got a big plus up this year. And we might see a lot of growth in space, particularly if we're successful capturing US Space Command headquarters and some of the other things that are going on here. We do support, probably the biggest thing that is new that would be opportunity incentive here is New Mexico has a lot of open outdoor space that we could take better advantage of for testing of a number of our systems. We could use that for Spaceport America, for space launch, for directed energy systems. There are a number of initiatives on afoot to stand up some of these new areas. We do use White Sands Missile Range, but it's very busy. It's probably the busiest test range in the US. And so public-private partnerships on some of that and enabling that to happen, being able to handle the risk. We are talking about taking space launch systems and directed energy weapons into some of these areas. Typically, we do that work on government ranges because we'll indemnify for liability and we'll make sure that that's all handled. But there's an opportunity there for, like I said, public and private. And how do we incentivize that and make that happen? And the small business industrial base is something I've been keeping my eye on for a number of years. We've been very successful starting up a number of small businesses here, is particularly for space and directed energy. What we see though is once they become profitable, they get snapped up in the big five or other major defense industry partners, and that's not always the best for the New Mexico economy. It's not always the best for competition and best pricing and value for the taxpayer. So that's an area that I think New Mexico could think about. And I don't have really concrete recommendations. We're doing a lot of this stuff right now. Venture capital was mentioned. One of the others would be some state type of economic development or startup funding, because we have a lot of companies that, again, they're doing military unique things and they really need help commercializing, marketing, and then productizing for dual use applications. We have been doing a lot of work in accelerators and with the whole community, with Rainforest Innovations, with all of that, with IP licensing and trying to get venture capital. But I'm wondering if there's something the state might be able to do in an enhanced way there to kind of provide that bridge funding. I was interested to hear about the program that they have down at Socorro. I think, was it Arapahoe or I'm not sure what that was exactly. Arrowhead is what I think Van said. So that was new to me. Maybe that's a model that we could use more broadly. But those are my thoughts, and I know we're out of time. Thanks for the opportunity to be part of the panel. And I think this is a great event. I think there is great opportunity for New Mexico with more strategic thought and partnering across all the ecosystems.
Thanks, Kelly, and Eric, Tom, Scott, thanks to you as well. Really appreciate hearing your thoughts.